So, I'm recording 2 videos today instead of my usual one for Thursday and one for Tuesday because I didn't record on Tuesday. I've had an extremely busy week. My fiance and I have been cleaning out totes to bring to my parents' house to store because we live in a teeny tiny apartment and we have no space. So we're bringing some of our non-essentials to be stored at my parents'. And I'm exhausted. Alright, we're ready for chapter 9. And I'm sorry if my throat's a little scratchy. It's starting to be spring, which is beautiful for the weather, but it's not beautiful for my allergies. Chapter 9. All the usual. Goodness, I expected that to be unusual, but if a house is seated on some melancholy place, or built in some old romantic manner, or if any particular accident had happened in it, such as murder, sudden death, or the like, that house has a mark set on it, and was afterward esteemed the habitation of a ghost. Next to conventional white-clad or transparent ghost, our favorite image of the unknown probably is summed up in the words haunted house. We instantly visualize a deserted, decaying mansion, standing apart from its neighbors, a place whose appearance is forbidding. We are certain that if we tried to approach it, we'd be impeded by an atmosphere thick with hostility. If we ventured inside, we know there'd be oppressive silence at first. Then the door would slam behind us, and when we ran, we'd find it locked. And then, many stereotype haunted houses exist. But ghostly stories often have settings that are pleasant and busily occupied. For instance, St. Louis psychic investigator Bevy Yeagers was once called with her squad of counterparts to help a family living in an apparently haunted modern apartment. Residents on each side of this family reported no problems. Our first house first. In 1998, the year I was born, a beautiful book about the governor's mansion was published in Jefferson City. Naturally, the house is believed to have some ghost. How could it not, having stood so long and seen so much drama? And if Wallace could talk, Missouri's First Lady, Mrs. Jean Carnahan, acknowledged this even as she assembled, in a scholarly way, hundreds of illustrations that the essence of uncountable state documents to tell the story of each governor's family preceding hers in the lovely 1871 house. At Halloween time in 1997, television station KRCG in Jefferson City carried a series of ghost tales set in central Missouri. One concerned a little girl encountered in the attic of the governor's mansion. As the story was related, camera shifted to the lawn and a fountain ornated by the bronze figure of a child happily dancing in the spray. The statue was said to have been cast in memory of that girl in the attic. She is believed to be a 9-year-old named Carrie Crittenden, who died in 1883. Her father, Governor Thomas Crittenden, is remembered partly for taking a successful stand against bandit and guerrilla activity in the state, and is credited for setting in modern events that resulted in Jesse James' death and Frank James' surrender. During Crittenden's most stringent efforts, Mrs. Carnahan tells us his life was threatened, as as was the well-being of his daughter. Therefore, he kept bodyguards with lively golden-haired Carrie at all times. Like other powerful people of this era, though, he was helpless against disease. Diphtheria took Carrie just as it took thousands of other Missouri children. He expressed his grief in a song, My Child, that he wrote and published after her death. Mrs. Carnahan's book and I feel like I've got my contacts in, so I always feel like I'm reading something odd. Mrs. Carnahan's book and other sources say that during Governor Christopher Bond's tenure, exactly 100 years after Carrie's death, a repairman came down from the attic at the end of a day's work and said to a member of Mrs. Bond's staff, "You might want to mention to them that their little girl is playing around up there. She spent most of the day with me." When told that the Bonds had no little girl, he insisted, "Well, then it must be some neighbor's, because she hung around me for hours. She was 8 years old or so, wearing a white dress." A search of the attics and staircases disclosed no child. Some sources say that that particular worker did not return to finish his project. So far as is recorded, Carrie, first person to die in the current mansion, has not appeared since that day in the attic. Neither of the other two people who died in the mansion seems to have returned in ghostly form. One was Governor John Sappington's Marmaduke, who served from John Sappington Marmaduke. I just assumed it was his Marmaduke. Who served from 1885 to 1887. He'd been in the Confederate Army and reportedly told his fellow soldiers camped across the river in view of the mansion that he would someday live there. The other person who died in the mansion was Miss Alexander Dockery, the former Mary Elizabeth Bird. She had been a semi-invalid when she came to the mansion, but still managed to be an active and admired First Lady. Her death came on January 1st, 1903. By interesting coincidence, each of these... That was a random yawn. By interesting coincidence, each of these people died during a holiday season and so lay in the state among festive decorations. According to the KRCG, other haunts inhabit the mansion, but none I had set an alarm and completely forgot about it. I wanted to make extra sure I woke up for you guys. Took a nap earlier. According to the KRCG, other haunts inhabit the mansion, but none seem connected to any particular event of its 129-year history. My allergies make me winded. I just got up to turn off my alarm. Objects do move around at times, the documentary said, and other inexplicable things happen. Candles put out fresh for some event are found shortly after melted down from use. Sounds reported mainly by guards who are in the mansion at night are of quiet merriment, like the guests assembling for one of many fetes the mansion has seen. Sometimes barely audible voices and ripples of laughter seem to move up the stairs or through the hallways as if groups were making their way to the ballroom or dining room. Oh, on that note, had a little story I wanted to share with you guys as well, which kind of goes with this. As a kid, well, I guess not really a kid, but my family moved into this farmhouse, and I mentioned in earlier videos, or back in, I believe, chapter 7, but it often feels like I have dreams about that house still, and it's so vivid that I can, feel the walls and the grass beneath my feet, and it almost suggests there's, maybe a part of me that's still there in a way. And I wonder if that's the reason for some of the voices and ripples of laughter in like houses like this, in moments where you've lived in a place during important parts of your life, or a place that was of importance to you. Who knows? Maybe you leave a piece of you there when you leave. It was a suggestion that somebody had told me after I told them about my very vivid dreams. My fiance is a little bit of a skeptic, and he believes that, it's just, my imagination. My dad believes it's because we spent so much time there. It was the house that I lived in the longest. And it's the first house where my family really got to be a family. My dad wasn't working all the time. He was home a lot more. My mother's mental health was doing really good. Me and my brother were old enough to enjoy living on a farm. And those were good times for us. We left because of a number of reasons, mostly concerning the owners of the house, who were friends of ours who were moving. And they moved up to the city to be closer to their kids. But I was too young to really understand exactly what happened, but we ended up selling all of our animals and moving away. But, I still have the oddest dreams about it. Anyway, back to the story. Only once has anything alarming enough happened that a guard resigned. He was on duty alone, the book says, when the mansion's elevator began moving about erratically. He suspected vandals at once, and was alarmed at what this could mean for the building's priceless historic contents. Although he most likely called immediately for reinforcements, he also sprinted up and down stairs with drawn gun, trying to intercept the elevator. It remained unresponsive to calls, and continued to zip about, stopping here and there. No vandalism was found, and no sign of forced entry, but it's easy to understand the guard's panic. No report exists of the elevator misbehaving since that night. Undoubtedly, it was thoroughly examined and serviced to reassure everyone that it could be used again without fear. And undoubtedly, such an occurrence makes everyone in the mansion happy to accept unthreatening little mysteries like footsteps heard in carpeted areas where actual footfalls would be silent. A tricycle ghost. Cal Dothage of Iron County speaks freely about an interesting little ghost who shared his life for several years in 1970. He and a partner bought a 2-story white farmhouse in Arcadia Valley near Ironton, and made a restaurant of it. Dothage says that in the 5 months it took to remodel the place, they noticed a number of unusual sounds in the house, but blamed them on winds that blew across the open fields surrounding them. In spring of 1971, when they opened the restaurant, which they called Plain and Fancy, Dothage says, the sounds took on a different tone, more like a person walking or playing in the front part of the house. These sounds never came past the front hall and front room, and that's when we started to get the feeling that maybe more was going on than just the wind. Dothage describes the sensation he once had of somebody standing next to him in the hall when he knew nobody else was in the house. He mentioned this to nobody, not wanting to make his waitresses nervous. But a few weeks later, one of them asked if he ever felt someone was in the hall. The next interesting experience came when he was in the kitchen and one of his waitresses was upstairs in the office. Cal heard his name called from the front hall and went to see what Carol wanted. She was coming down the stairs to see what he wanted, for he had heard him calling her. With the similarity in names, he said, it's easy to see why both responded, but who had called them? Dothage says he spent a little time after that trying to talk to whoever shared the house, but with no luck. He could now hear the sounds of a tricycle in the front rooms, one of those old-fashioned metal tricycles you could hear rattling wheels and a tinkling of the bell as she rode around. In the years that followed, those sounds continued, and various unusual things happened in the house. Only a few times, however, did employees or customers comment about feeling disturbed. One guest said she felt something against her in the hall and apologized, not realizing for a moment that nobody was there. Dothage comments that a psychic friend told him the reason there is often such strong disagreement about whether or not a place is haunted. Some people are receivers, while some are too busy transmitting into the present to feel anything from the spirit world. But one night, 4 people together saw the little cyclist. Dothage and 3 of his staff had closed the restaurant and were getting ready to leave, standing together in the back dining room with a direct view of the front porch. We all saw the same thing at the same time, he said. A small girl dressed in a yellow dress with a high collar. Some of the people with Dothage that night had heard him talk about his resident ghost, and some had not. I went up to the porch, he says, but there was nothing there. This was the first time anyone had seen her, but it was not the last. The child made another appearance at Christmas time that same year. A friend down from St. Louis for dinner took a picture of the restaurant's Christmas tree. The next weekend, he made another trip to show them what his film had captured. Looking in from the upper part of the window was the little girl in her yellow dress, Dothage says. As this part of the window was 8 feet above the ground, she had to be standing on air. Off and on for the rest of the time we owned the house, she made herself known in one way or another. In 1978, Missouri Life magazine did a story on the restaurant, and among materials Dothage loaned them was that picture of the Christmas tree. After their article appeared, he received everything back except that one picture. The friend in St. Louis was never able to locate the negative. Dothage tried repeatedly to find out if the history of the house would shed any light, but it did not. He concluded that the child must have been from a different house on the same site. That could be the reason she never came beyond the front rooms, and why she appeared to be standing on a floor higher than ours. Whitmore House. According to the Robbie Courtway in Spirits of St. Louis, a lively seance at Whitmore House in May 1972 was the basis for the film Ghostbusters. Gordon Honer, a St. Louis psychic investigator who participated in the events, told her this. For the incident in question, readers can go to Courtway's gripping book. Here's part of the underlying background, as offered in a St. Louis Post-Dispatch article on October 26, 1986. October 26 is my fiance's birthday. Donated to Washington University by the heirs of the Whitmore family, the mansion was renovated at a cost of $550,000 to serve as a faculty club. The late Art Klein was hired to manage the building in its new role. He told reporter Christine Bertelson that why do these last names have to be so tongue-twisting? That he began with a hearty disregard for ghost stories. His experience in the house changed him and elicited the memorable statement, if you believe in God, you believe in something supernatural. If you believe there is good, then it is possible there is bad. I hate to say I believe in ghosts, but after the noises I've heard and the things I've seen, for some time, Klein was able to dismiss the sounds he heard as natural to any house built at the turn of the century. But working there alone at night on bookkeeping, he grew more and more uneasy. Things were hard to pin down, he told Bertelson. With they happened so often, I began to have an eerie feeling like I was not alone. Too frequently, he had to interrupt his work to check doors and windows to make sure nobody could have entered the house. He changed his schedule so that he could do book work during the daylight hours. Manifestations intensified to the point that guests complained of sleep ruined by the sounds of doors and windows opening and closing. Klein himself heard heavy footsteps in the unoccupied room just above his office, and the atmosphere around him was at times oddly cold. Once he heard wire coat hangers in a meeting room closet jangle loudly, and while he paused to listen, they jangled again. Finally, Klein saw something, which he compared to a cloud of room deodorant spray, wavering and quick to disappear. This was not a one-time phenomenon, but he at least was spared the sight. Some kitchen employees reported of half a man, that is, just from the waist up, at the cutting board. Klein's own worst experience came after a large and successful reception. When he was closing up Goodness, I'm getting winded. When he was closing up the building, he heard an angry voice in the lobby, like several men yelling. He said, when he went to look, of course, Klein found nobody there, and the front doors locked as he had left them after his last guest departed. When Klein returned to his office, the sounds in the lobby began again, and he said, what I did then shows how sure I was there were intruders in the house. He went to the kitchen and armed himself with the largest knife he could find. Nothing else happened, and he was thankful his closing up duties were almost done. He said he was never so happy to be back in his car and headed home. At this point, Klein reported events to college administration, but was told that there had to be a natural explanation for all he had witnessed and been told by employees and guests. He must not rock the boat, must not create publicity that would make their institution look silly. The story didn't say whether Klein resigned or lost his job, but it did quote the manager who followed him. She had seen and heard nothing herself, but the staff persisted in reporting the half-man and other strange things to her. Near the end of the Post-Dispatch story was a statement from Alberta Jackson, a housekeeper at Whitmore House. She said she often felt something like a wind passing over my arm, but she was not frightened enough to resign her job. I figured I never did anything to it, so why should it do something to me? Whew. Getting all sorts of tongue-tied. Sorry if there's any noises going on in the background. Like I said, it's a beautiful day and it's only 5:30, so everybody's out and about. Joyce O'Neill, editor of Senior Living magazine, reported in that publication in October of 1997 on her family's experience. Sorry about that loud conversation. Joyce O'Neill, editor of Senior Living magazine, reported that in that publication on October of 1997 on her family's experience living in a turn-of-the-century house in Republic near Springfield. She said she and her husband bought the place in 1963, charmed by its carpenter style and its roominess. It had belonged to a hero of the Civil War and stood where his log cabin had once been. They knew that many families had lived in the house, that over the years it would have seen many deaths and other drama, but she says, we brushed aside the rumors that it was haunted. They found, however, that their dogs sometimes refused to go upstairs. Their children who slept up there often reported seeing gauzy figures moving about, sometimes standing near their beds. Once accustomed to this, the children said it was not frightening, but made them feel calm and peaceful. O'Neill says she and her husband never saw anything, but did hear strange sounds, including the crash mentioned in another chapter, and they did find something curious in remodeling. Behind what they thought was an outside wall was a tiny room, occupied only by a large portrait of a man and woman, which raised disquieting questions. Since the picture was not removed before the wall was put up, it must have been the reason for building the wall. What could have happened to make people so determined to hide the picture forever, but unwilling to just take it down and dispose of it in some way? Of course, the picture could have been left as an oversight by someone who simply wanted to change the contour of the room. Inquiries in the area led the O'Neills to one person who thought the couple in the picture were distant relatives of hers, but she had no idea why their picture had been isolated. The O'Neill family saw many happy years in the house and added numerous features to enhance its beauty, indoors and out. One of their additions was a swimming pool. They gave special attention to atmospheric Halloween parties, and none of these were visited audibly or visibly by any haunts. During the couple's tenancy, both their mothers died there, both at an age and in conditions of health that kept these deaths from being remarkable in any way. A former son-in-law killed himself in the backyard, but his emotional state had nothing to do with the house. When the O'Neills sold the place, it was to a man who wanted it for a funeral home and remarked repeatedly how perfect it would be for that purpose. Before he had completed the remodeling, he planned the house burned. Ooh. Before he completed the remodeling he planned, the house burned, and he lost his life in the fire. Our oldest haunted house, one of the oldest buildings in Missouri's oldest town, St. Genevieve, is the Guibord House? Goodness, that's a weird one. Guibourd? Guibord? Since 1939, its inhabitants have reported assorted hauntings. It would be interesting to know if there were others earlier. The house was built in 1784, only 34 years after the first Creole families settled in an area that was to become part of the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803 and in 1812, became part of Missouri Territory. The builder, Jacques Dubreuil, was a native of France, and his descendants occupied the house in 1906. Some of their tragedy could be blamed for the hauntings, perhaps. A daughter, Victorine, died under its roof while quite young, and a son killed himself there. Goodness, so much suicide. The first record of unusual happenings was when Jules Val, a new owner, recovering from a surgery, claimed to feel a touch on his shoulder. There, he saw 3 little old men dressed in rough woolen shirts, but minus the lower halves of their body, beside his bed. Because they smiled and nodded, he concluded they had come to assure him of recovery and extended life. He did live for 10 more years. Val's much younger wife, Anne Marie, never saw those particular apparitions, but said she always felt presence in the house. After a favorite servant, Dora, died, Anne Marie continued to hear the woman's familiar footfalls in the apartment she had occupied. Anne Marie took this as a comforting message that Dora was not really gone and still cared for her. Other servants who came to the house told of hearing the footfalls too. Nothing frightened Anne Marie until a night when loud slamming sounds came from her late husband's bedroom, sounds suggesting heavy objects being thrown against walls, and accompanied by glassy crashes and tinklings. Next morning, when she gathered the courage to look, Anne Marie expected to find the scene of destruction, but nothing was changed. Nothing had been damaged. Suddenly outraged at her fear she had suffered the night before, Anne Marie screamed to the poltergeist, or whatever they were, that they could never frighten her away from the house and might as well leave it themselves. As we find in so many poltergeist stories, the noisemaker seemed to take her seriously and disturbed her no more. Anne Marie reported numerous unusual happenings in the house. She said that one of her dogs frequently became frightened. Goodness me. My allergies must be making me tired. Like I said, I did just wake up from like a 2-hour nap because I was yawning so much. Apparently it didn't help. She said that one of her dogs frequently became frightened and cringed and hid, then desperately wanted to go outside. Another, Jamie, would focus on a spot, growl softly, and barely wag his lowered tail as he did when meeting a new dog. She told of still another dog, Peter, who was especially fond of one of her friends. When this woman visited after Peter's death, Jamie did his greeting act several times, and they wondered if Peter had come to visit with his human friend. All these accounts come from Haunted America, a 1994 book by Michael Norman and Beth Scott, authors of several collections of ghost stories. They said that when they visited Guibord Valley House, Guibord Val House, gracious. And then caretaker Christine Balser told them of a few experiences that seemed related to the earlier haunts. She sometimes heard classical music being played on the piano, and that was present in the days of Victorine, a pianist. It sounded like diligent practice with many repetitions. Her own record player's turntable at times spun so fast that it could not be used. Light bulbs sometimes flared and faded, sometimes went off and came on. Christine described a frequent unnerving event of someone obscuring light temporarily, as though somebody had passed between her and the lamp. Christine said she felt uncomfortable in Jules' bedroom, even in daylight, when conducting tour groups. Though the through the house, and would not have considered going there alone at night. Eventually, she moved her sleeping arrangements into what had been slave quarters at the rear of the house. Though she knew great physical suffering and emotional turmoil had to have existed there, Christine said nothing disturbed her rest. Huggable and slightly haunted. I can identify with tree huggers, Elaine. Wow, that's a long name. De Rendinger of Franklin told me long ago, because I sometimes hug my house. She was reacting then to something I'd written about trees, but only now can I react to what she said. After visiting her historic house and interviewing her about its apparent but very mild hauntings, I asked her about the hugging. Just how does one do this? On the east end, she told me, when the sun has warmed the bricks, I just spread my arms out and hug. One can easily imagine that the warm brick seemed to pulsate faintly, like a living creature. It would be easy to fancy that the house was responding, and if ever a house responded to love, this one should. Elaine had loved it for years before she and her husband George bought it. They used to drive by, often admiring the building lines, awed by its history and the history it has seen. Sad that part of it was being used for hay storage. There was almost no chance it would ever know respectful, affectionate restoration. Neglect, deterioration, and eventual razing is the fate of all too many wonderful old houses. Circumstances, however, combined to make it possible for the Rendingers to buy the place and its 10 acres. This was in 1964, and the restoration still is not complete, for there was a great deal to do, most of it quite expensive. Elaine says that without George's carpentry skills, they could have never done what they've done. History of Cedar Grove is given in the story of Howard County, which Elaine helped to write and compile in 1999. Cedar Grove was built in 1824 by a pioneer farmer named Nicholas Amick. What he chose was federal style. And he reared 11 children there. Gracious. The second owner, Horace Kingsbury, was a doctor and from various business undertakings became a wealthy man. He added a large Greek revival section to the house. Elaine believes that her home may be the only one in Missouri to combine these two styles. Cedar Grove is listed in both the Missouri Historic Sites Catalog and the National Register of Historic Places. Among its notable features are fireplaces in every room, some 15-inch thick walls, and separated staircases to separated sections of the house. One unforgettable feature of Cedar Hill is that the Santa Fe Trail runs only a few yards from the front door. Early residents of the house would have daily witnessed traffic on the revered route, and across some cornfields the Missouri River rolls, usually at a safe distance, but in flood times a possible menace. Once Elaine saw it almost in her front yard, and she says one of the eeriest experiences of her life was in the flood of 1993. Listening as familiar sound of rustling tall corn became counterpoint to rising water that gurgled and roared through it. The hauntings, a Deringer daughter, Chris, alone in the house, watched a rocking chair rock briskly in the next room. All members of the family witnessed at one time or another the bathroom door, in earlier times an exterior door, opening just a bit as they walked by, as if someone peeked out, and a visitor who came when the family was away and intended to wait for them left abruptly, made uncomfortable by something. The old house seems to have given its loving custodians many clues to the lives lived there previously. Elaine had found writings of Dr. Kingsbury in one of his textbooks, as well as his saddlebags full of antique bottles lying flat on a rafter, as if placed there for safekeeping. She found a blue violin-shaped bottle, which she treasures so much that she always uses both hands to hold it. Elaine says that she often wished she could go outside her house and look into the lighted interior while former residents go about their business. She'd particularly like to see one of the families gathered around a table to eat. Could it be that some of what we consider ghostly visitation stems from a reverse on this impulse? Maybe beings from the past just enjoy revisiting their old home in what is to them the future. And that's the end of chapter 9. Thank goodness, because I am so tongue-tied. I will, I guess, see you guys in a couple of months in this same state. I'm so off with my book readings and then my trigger videos. I've got trigger videos that go way further out than my book readings because I've kind of let those lax a little bit. It's a lot harder for me to read on video than it is for me to do a couple of ASMR triggers. So you guys have a good day or night or whatever.